Welcome to our Emerging Issues webinar. Today's presentation is entitled Widening the Lens on Human Trafficking, and we're very happy to see so many of you that have joined us today. I'm your host, Andy Blanchard, and I lead our Emerging Issues team here at Verisk. Now, at the onset here, I did want to just take a moment to note that human trafficking has been a growing concern for many, including those in our P&C community. Anecdotally, I've noticed a real uptick in insurer questions on this topic that both our Emerging Issues team and our product developers have been fielding recently. So we're really pleased to have the opportunity to share some of our findings with you today. But at the same time, this is a heavy topic. And while our focus is limited to related insurance considerations, we acknowledge and we lament the serious human toll involved here. So with that, I'm going to, as usual, jump into our policy statement. The policy of Verisk Analytics and subsidiary companies is to comply in all respects with federal and state antitrust laws. With this in mind, we want to mention that all seminars held under our auspices, this policy prohibits discussion of certain topics. Because we want to avoid even the appearance of an antitrust violation, we go beyond the letter of the law and we will not discuss any matter that violates the spirit of the antitrust laws or could be perceived as doing so. A copy of our policy statement on discussion at meetings can be found at verisk.com/settlement. And with us on the call today is Verisk attorney Ananya Barman. Ananya, would you like to introduce yourself and offer us some guidance before we get going?
Thank you, Andy. Yes. Hello, everyone. As Andy mentioned, my name is Ananya Barman. I am in-house counsel at Verisk. My role as the Verisk attorney at these meetings is to ensure that we abide by the guidelines that are presented in our policy statement on discussion at meetings, which, as Andy previously mentioned, it can be found at the link that is displayed on the screen. So very briefly, it is our company policy to comply with all respects of federal and state antitrust laws, and of course, any other laws that may apply to this discussion. So our policy statement restricts discussion of certain topics which are described in detail there, and I'm not going to go through those at today's meeting. But I just want to make a quick note that these restrictions also apply to any questions or comments that are submitted through the chat feature, and of course, our presenters' responses to them. And that's all I have for today. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Ananya. So we've got a very full presentation today. I'm trying to, here we are, pull up the agenda. You can see it's a very full presentation. Just want to hit on a few quick points before we get there. Your feedback, your questions, they're invaluable to us. So please, Ananya mentioned the chat function. Please use it in GoToWebinar. Put your questions, put your comments there. Only we here at Verisk can see what you put in the chat. If we can't get to your questions now, we will endeavor to get to them all after the fact and follow up. Next and final point here, we are recording this presentation today and we intend to post it on our website at core.verisk.com. So please be sure to check out the recorded webinar. We also look to put the slides up there as well for those interested. And again, as you can see, the webinar is very busy. We've got a lot of great information coming your way and speakers lined up. So allow me to pass the mic to our next speaker, Kevin Sullivan. Kevin?
Thank you, Andy. Before we take a deeper dive into the subject of human trafficking, I wanted to first start us off with a more zoomed out overview of what it is, how it's often categorized, and the potential risks that it poses. Let's begin by establishing a working definition for the purposes of today's discussion. While the wording may at times appear different, most international organizations and US federal agencies have landed on something similar to the following to describe human trafficking, an umbrella term used to describe trafficking in persons in its various forms. Quote, human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. this definition coming from the US Department of Homeland Security. Now, this definition, though certainly not exhaustive, was in large part inspired by the so-called Palermo Protocol, a protocol to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2000 and later implemented into force in 2003 to help build another, sorry, let's go back one slide, to help build a framework for addressing human trafficking. One second. There we are. Perhaps noticeable by its absence from this definition is the term human smuggling, a distinction often made by US law enforcement officials to emphasize that while human trafficking may often involve some form of smuggling, people can be trafficked and exploited without ever leaving their hometown. We'll have more on that in just a bit. While the categories of human trafficking, sometimes referred to by advocacy groups and international institutions as modern-day slavery, may sometimes vary, its different manifestations are generally broken down into the buckets that you see before you. Forced labor, which according to the UN-affiliated International Labor Organization, or ILO, can include all work exacted under the menace of any penalty from an involuntary participant. This can often include different forms of exploitation, such as peonage or even debt bondage. The ILO has reported in 2022 that the global COVID-19 pandemic led to a spike in these practices, as economic disruptions led to greater indebtedness among workers. This is an important point in terms of the potential trajectory of forced labor globally. According to a 2023 World Bank analysis, approximately 8.6% of the global population are projected to live in extreme poverty, a primary driver of forced labor and indeed all iterations of human trafficking. The global pandemic likely hindered efforts to reduce global poverty, and according to the same World Bank analysis, potentially exacerbated the conditions in which human trafficking is known to thrive. Now, human trafficking's victims, as we established, can be lured through coercion, fraud, or force. It thrives around the world and across multiple industries. Global crises, conflicts, and climate change serve as additional accelerants, according to the United Nations. Sex trafficking, which we'll take a closer look at in just a bit, is another form of compelled labor, afflicting women, men, and children the world over. There are, of course, other forms of human trafficking, including forced marriage, state-imposed labor, and various forms of child exploitation, which can include both sexual exploitation and forced labor. It's important to note that these forms of exploitation are neither monolithic nor static, according to reports and studies. Studies show that vulnerable targets may move in and out of these conditions, sometimes succumbing to multiple forms of trafficking. What we do know, the practice, according to reports, is highly lucrative, generating, according to one report, $150 billion in illicit revenue annually for the globe's private and shadow economies. On this slide, we provided a snapshot of human trafficking around the world. Nearly 50 million people lived in modern slavery as of 2021, more than half of those, according to the ILO, subjected to forced labor. The Asia Pacific region has the highest number of people in forced labor, approximately 15 million. And according to the same agency, the Arab states have the highest prevalence of compelled labor at 5.3 instances per 1,000 people. Now we see here, according to the ILO data, that more than 25 million people were subjected to forced labor on any given day as of 2021. Children, according to the same report, accounted for approximately 12% of all those involved in forced labor worldwide, with more than half of them documented as being involved in some form of commercial sexual exploitation. Before we move on, I think it is important also just to note that the countries marked in white and lined on the accompanying map, featuring data from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, are marked as such not because those countries necessarily lack human trafficking entirely, but because they lacked sufficient data at the time of reporting. Now, I alluded briefly earlier in the presentation to an international push in 2000 to establish an agreed upon framework for identifying and addressing trafficking in persons. Up next, I'll hand things over to my colleague, Laura Panesso, who will take us through the legislative and regulatory landscape on human trafficking here in the United States. Laura?
Thanks, Kevin. As Kevin mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislative and regulatory landscape, both at the federal level as well as the state level. But first, some background. Back in 2003, over 20 years ago, the first state laws to criminalize human trafficking began passing. Since then, every state has enacted laws establishing criminal penalties for traffickers seeking to profit from forced labor or sexual servitude. While the laws vary in both their approach to human trafficking as well as their strictness, there are several underlying trends. First, addressing traffickers. State laws include a wide variety of activities under their definition of trafficking. Differences in trafficking definitions are critical to identifying who has criminal culpability. Most commonly, trafficking activities are defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons for the purpose of exploitation. Some jurisdictions have expanded their definition of trafficking by including activities like purchasing, benefiting, or profiting. Next, facilitators. Some states have enacted measures that specifically address penalties that apply to a business entity if it has committed or has been used in committing a human trafficking crime. Laws also create procedures for the dissolution of the business entity, as well as establishing additional fines. And demand. State laws vary on the criminal penalties they assess on people who purchase sex. Some states punish sex purchasers the same as traffickers, generally with felony-level crimes, while others punish them with misdemeanors associated with paying for prostitution or solicitation. A third option some states have taken is to kind of assign a middle ground crime, usually being either a more severe version of solicitation or a less severe form of human trafficking. And now criminalization of domestic minor sex trafficking. State trafficking laws address many factors and circumstances that can enhance the criminal penalties for trafficking crimes, particularly with respect to domestic minor sex trafficking. Laws, for example, can assign more severe or additional penalties for trafficking when the crimes are committed against vulnerable populations, like children, undocumented immigrants, and people with a mental illness, or are effectuated through aggravating circumstances, like the use of violence, branding, or drug addiction. There may also be protective provisions, again, particularly for minor victims. State lawmakers have legislated several criminal protections and civil remedies for trafficking victims within the judicial system. Measures have provided immunity to, diversion from, and affirmative defenses against criminal prosecution for actions victims were forced to commit by their traffickers. At least 29 states have created procedures for survivors to expunge, vacate, or seal criminal records related to being trafficked. However, many of these laws have specific provisions and processes and are limited to certain crimes. However, clearing a survivor's criminal record may remove barriers to obtaining housing, gaining employment, pursuing education, and restoring certain civic rights. 27 states provide restitution for trafficked survivors, and 34 states provide standing for survivors' civil suits. Additionally, some states provide judicial protections with respect to immunity, particularly for minors again, and 31 states provide affirmative defense for trafficking victims. We also see expungement being addressed in some states. In addition, there are around 225 multi-sector anti-trafficking institutions across 50 states, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam to help combat human trafficking across the nation. Moving on to some federal activity. In the last 2 decades, Congress has passed a number of comprehensive bills designed to bring the full power and attention of the federal government to the fight against human trafficking. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 equipped the U.S. government with new tools and resources to mount a comprehensive and coordinated campaign to eliminate modern forms of slavery, both domestically and internationally. Critically, the TVPA established the framework for the 3 Ps of the fight against human trafficking: protection, prevention, and prosecution. Federal acts since 2000 include the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Acts of 2003 and 2005, and the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008. And I'll refer to this as the TVPRA of 2008. This 2008 reauthorization featured new measures to prevent and deter trafficking and further improved the tools available to hold traffickers accountable. The TVPRA of 2008 also included 3 changes in the civil cause of action available to trafficking victims. First, it enlarged the civil cause of action to cover victims of violations of the involuntary servitude and trafficking provisions. Second, it gave victims a cause of action against those who have profited from their exploitation. And third, it provided an explicit 10-year statute of limitations within which such suits would have to be filed. Under prior law, victims maintained a cause of action for violations of forced labor, peonage-related trafficking, sex trafficking of children, or by force, fraud, or coercion. The TVPRA of 2008 was amended to include additional offenses, including peonage, enticement into slavery, sale into involuntary servitude, and unlawful compelled service. Moreover, it creates a cause of action for victims against anyone who benefits from any such violation. An individual who is a victim of a violation of the statute may bring a civil action against the perpetrator or whoever knowingly benefits financially or by receiving anything of value from participation in a venture which that person knew or should have known was engaged in an act in violation of the statute in an appropriate district court of the U.S. and may recover damages and reasonable attorney's fees. This creates civil liability both for those who face criminal liability for their profiteering and those who do not, which may also be a potential driver of insurance exposure. Moving on to some February 2024 activity. Back in February, the Enhancing Detection of Human Trafficking Act passed unanimously. HR 443 ensures the Department of Labor effectively trains its employees to recognize and respond to the illegal trade of people for exploitation or commercial gain. Also back in February, the House overwhelmingly passed reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act for 5 years and strengthened and expanded successful anti-trafficking programs to bolster the fight against modern-day slavery. Lastly, on the federal front, the report to Congress, the annual Trafficking in Persons or TIP report provides an in-depth description of the trafficking problem in each country or territory and an analysis of government efforts to address trafficking. In the 2023 TIP report, 28 countries met the criteria for the special watch list. Now, some state activity. As I mentioned in my earlier brief overview, states began passing laws back in 2003, with Washington and Texas the first. Wyoming's passage of anti-human trafficking legislation in 2013 brought the total to all 50 states with anti-human trafficking laws on the books. And of course, the states are certainly not uniform in how or what exactly they address. Some states include only sex trafficking and not labor trafficking. Some laws only address sex trafficking of minors. The vast majority of state trafficking laws do not include victim assistance, a private right of action, or protection from arrest based on offenses committed as a result of being victimized. Moving to some very recent activity, around 1,600 bills have been introduced during the 2023-2024 legislative session. California has introduced the highest number of bills, followed by Illinois, New Jersey, and Mississippi. And I'll touch on some examples here. I may not hit every single bullet given our time constraint. First, an example of education. Delaware Concurrent Resolution 77 recognized January 2024 as Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Florida created the statewide Council on Human Trafficking to enhance the development and coordination of state and local law enforcement and social services responses to fight commercial sexual exploitation as a form of human trafficking and to support victims. In Hawaii, a bill establishes a statewide human trafficking prevention program overseen by the Department of the Attorney General to provide services and assistance to commercially sexually exploited children and victims of human trafficking. And on vacation of conviction, and really a step further, New Jersey has a bill that would provide a process for a person to vacate and expunge, as applicable, all arrest charges, complaints, convictions, or other dispositions, as well as DNA records for violations of law committed by the person as a result of the person's status as a victim of human trafficking. And then just some examples of some trends that we're seeing. Illinois legislation would delete requirements that victims must report the crime within certain time periods for certain crimes to be eligible to apply for an award, so addressing some statutes of limitations. Utah has a bill that clarifies the requirements for bringing a civil action for human trafficking and allows for the dissolution of a nonprofit organization for criminal conduct by a director, member, or employee of the nonprofit corporation that is a felony offense or an offense described in the Sexual Exploitation Act. Illinois would require the completion of a human trafficking prevention course approved by the Secretary of State before the issuance or renewal of a commercial driver's license. It also provides that the Secretary shall establish guidelines for training standards and make available a list of approved training courses. Louisiana has a bill addressing penalties. Currently, Louisiana provides an increase in the penalty for trafficking persons under the age of 18 for commercial sexual activity from a fine not to exceed $50,000, imprisonment at hard labor for not less than 15 or more than 50. This would expand it to a fine not to exceed $75,000 and life imprisonment at hard labor without the possibility of probation or parole. Indiana legislation would require an owner or operator of a public lodging establishment to provide human trafficking awareness training for employees. And California SB 727 was actually signed by the governor back in October and authorizes a plaintiff in an action arising from human trafficking to seek a finding that specific debts were incurred as a result of the trafficking and without the consent of the plaintiff. So looking to some protections from economic abuse. And lastly, an Idaho bill would allow prosecutors to seek forfeiture once a defendant has been convicted of human trafficking to ensure the trafficker does not profit from the illicit activity. Again, just some examples of the trends that we're seeing. And with that, I will hand it back to Kevin.
Thanks so much, Laura. Really interesting details on government and regulatory activity regarding human trafficking, and an important table setter, I think, for the next part of our discussion. Up next, we'll take a closer look at the current state of human trafficking in the United States. We see here, according to a 2023 Justice Department report, that there was a 49% increase in human trafficking referrals over a 10-year span between the years 2011 and 2021. This was in spite of an overall population decrease over that same stretch of time, according to data generated by the United States Census Bureau. Federal prosecutions doubled in that same amount of time, though several studies suggest that repeated undercounting may be creating an incomplete picture of the broader problem in the country. This deficiency in data, according to analysts at the Department of Justice, can be in part attributed to insufficient training of law enforcement at the state and local level, in addition to the relative recency of federal efforts to centralize data on trafficking. Here we have a list of some of the industries at higher risk of human trafficking exposure, applying a rating score provided by our partners at Verisk Maplecroft. Some of the industries listed here will likely come as no surprise: agriculture, construction, manufacturing, all of them fairly consistent with industries flagged earlier as being problematic globally in regard to human trafficking. What this often looks like when put into practice inside the United States is something like one case in South Georgia, where in 2021, according to one report, 26 migrant farm laborers were rescued from what prosecutors described as modern-day slavery, an exploitation in which workers were reportedly held in abusive conditions with limited access to food and basic resources. There was another case in Alabama, where in 2022, a news investigation found that at least 4 major auto part suppliers were employing child labor in plants throughout the state, and possibly across the southern US. Or like in Iowa, where, according to news reports, Labor Department investigators this year accused one janitorial services company of employing children as young as 14 to work in slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants, cleaning instruments such as bone cutting saws, head splitters, and jaw pullers. Next, we'll take a look at some of the more common human trafficking risk pathways that face these industries and companies. In the United States, we can see that instances of sex trafficking accounted for 96% of all new federal criminal human trafficking cases in the year 2022. This, according to a report released last year by the Human Trafficking Institute. Sex trafficking has also, in recent years, led to a number of reported civil lawsuits brought by plaintiffs, alleging that hoteliers profited from their being trafficked, while allegedly taking insufficient steps to prevent the practice. Indeed, the number of federal civil sex trafficking cases nearly tripled in 2022, according to a report by the Human Trafficking Legal Center, reflecting, according to the organization, a surge in sex trafficking cases filed against hotels. And in at least one reported case, a hotel seeking financial reimbursement brought litigation against its insurance provider. Earlier, we highlighted the distinction often made by law enforcement officials between human smuggling and human trafficking. The smuggling of people across the southern US border has, however, resulted in a number of tragic and high-profile cases in recent years. In 2022, for example, 53 migrants died in what remains the nation's deadliest human smuggling event in the US to date. 8 children and 1 pregnant woman were among the dozens of victims discovered in a sweltering trailer parked next to an isolated road in San Antonio, Texas, left there without water or air conditioning. Multiple defendants, including the truck's driver, faced possible life sentences. A driver for an Iowa-based trucking company was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms without parole for his reported role in a 2017 human smuggling scheme that left a total of 10 dead, after dozens of migrants were found packed inside his parked semi-trailer in a retail store parking lot left in the 100-degree Texas heat. The trucking company was never directly implicated in the scheme, according to news reports, but was subsequently shuttered by the Labor Department for reported safety violations later that year. Such potentially deadly conditions are unfortunately not rare for those being smuggled across the border for profit. In a 2023 Justice Department indictment outlining the breadth of a money laundering scheme linked to a trafficking operation, Department of Justice officials described smuggling conditions that included migrants being stuffed into suitcases, crammed into repurposed water tankers, and hidden in wood crates strapped to flatbeds. Now, the U.S. Department of Labor has furthermore sounded an alarm in recent years on cases of child labor exploitation across the country. Between 2018 and 2022, the department has seen a 69% increase in instances of child labor. In 2023, for example, the Labor Department fined one of the nation's largest food safety sanitation contractors $1.5 million in civil money penalties for the employment of children working hazardous occupations, often in overnight shifts, at facilities for some of the biggest food processing names in the U.S. And just last month, the Labor Department fined a Tennessee parts manufacturer that supplies major outdoor and agricultural equipment retailers more than $250,000 for employing children as young as 14 in reportedly dangerous and oppressive conditions. We've taken a look at some of the aggregate numbers on human trafficking in the US. Next up, we'll discuss some of the specifics on one of the more recurrent and pernicious forms of human trafficking in the US, commercial sex trafficking. It's worth starting off with an important note of clarification articulated by the Human Trafficking Institute in their 2022 annual report. on the size and scope of sex trafficking operations in the United States. Contrary to in what's often reported in the media and on social media and in films, these trafficking schemes can reportedly range from very small to sometimes large criminal enterprises. For instance, data highlighted by the Institute shows that most federal sex trafficking cases involved only one defendant. Sex trafficking survivors are also, according to the Polaris Project, often trafficked by someone they know, such as an intimate partner or family member. Investigations and prosecutions into sex trafficking increased exponentially since the adoption of the laws and legislation that Laura discussed earlier. And while the number of new federal human trafficking criminal cases saw a decrease of 65% between 2020 and 2022, the Human Trafficking Institute advises a note of caution on that particular collection of data, noting that human trafficking prosecutions can often result from extensive investigations that can span over several months or even years. There's another angle to the sex trafficking challenge across the US that may also increase potential exposure for a number of American tech companies. As we see here, traffickers have, according to the Human Trafficking Institute, recruited more than half of their victims online since the year 2000. Americans' access to the internet has increased to a near point of saturation in that same stretch of time, according to the Pew Research Center, especially among young adults. This technological transformation has been paired alongside an explosion in mobile technology use among Americans. While these rapidly advancing technologies offer a wide array of benefits, they've also become a go-to tool for predatory sex traffickers. In 2023, for example, the CEO of one prominent social media company was asked by the Florida Attorney General to testify on their company's alleged role in human trafficking in the state, following an investigation by one news outlet that implicated several of the company's social products in the facilitation of human trafficking across the state. As we've noted here, that same social media company was sued in 2023 by one of its own shareholders over such allegations. This case, it's worth noting, is consistent with a trend highlighted by the Human Trafficking Legal Center in their 2022 report on civil litigation. Over a recent span of 5 years, plaintiffs have reportedly brought 32 cases against internet providers, including large social media platforms, alleging that said providers benefited financially from a venture that involved sex trafficking. We've covered the problem of sex trafficking in the United States, in addition to the potential risk pathways it presents for companies across the country. Pivoting just a bit now, let's take a look at another type of risk pathway developing at the American southern border. We know, thanks to data from the Department of Homeland Security, that most of the victims of forced labor across the United States tend to enter the country lawfully, more than 70% according to the department. But undocumented migrants nevertheless account for a significant portion of the American workforce, especially in targeted industries such as agriculture. There is also, as we discussed earlier, ample reported evidence to suggest that the smuggling of migrants across the southern US border continues to be a challenge for law enforcement and policymakers. This information aligns with government data gleaned in early 2024 by the Pew Research Center, showing that migrant encounters with US Border Patrol officials hit a record monthly high at the end of 2023. These numbers have fluctuated a bit in the early days of 2024, but this, combined with deeply reported accounts of increased migrant labor exploitation across the US, suggests a growing potential risk for US companies. According to a 2023 investigative series conducted by the New York Times, instances of forced labor, especially among undocumented and unaccompanied minors, appear to be rising across a variety of US industries in conjunction with the sharp increase in migrant entries along the US-Mexican border. This in-depth anecdotal reporting aligns with quantitative analysis from our partner Verisk Maplecroft, who recently cited an uptick in the frequency of forced labor violations, which can often involve the exploitation of undocumented workers. So where does this all leave us? Well, we know, thanks to the aforementioned Pew data, that encounters along the US southern border with undocumented migrants hit record highs at the end of 2023. Compounding this challenge are the reported shortcomings of the private auditing systems that have in recent decades become a relied upon mechanism for so many American companies to prevent labor abuses and violations. For example, in 2023, the New York Times found that private auditors had overlooked child labor in 20 production facilities surveyed by the paper. These children were reportedly found to be working at the top of supply chains, working, for example, for dairy producers that supply some of the nation's largest retailers, in snack food processing plants that supply large baby food manufacturers, and in slaughterhouses that supply large and popular fast food chains. In most of these instances, the errors and oversights reportedly developed along various points of the supply chain and through the alleged negligence of third-party contractors. In one case, for instance, an auditor for a large US pharmacy chain reportedly found that there was no way to verify the ages of workers at one of their facilities, a factory that supplied a number of large retailers. The staffing agency used by that supplier is now reportedly under investigation for child labor violations. Finally, if private systems of oversight are reportedly failing migrant children, there's some evidence to suggest that federal programs put in place to protect these same undocumented children are coming up short as well. A report released in February of this year by the Department of Health and Human Services' Office of Inspector General highlighted a number of gaps in the screening and follow-up policies used by the agency to keep track of unaccompanied migrant children entrusted with presumably vetted sponsors here in the US. Among its list of flagged oversights, HHS's internal watchdog found that nearly 20% of children had been released to sponsors with pending FBI checks related to a potential history of abuse or neglect. In more than 15% of cases, one or more of the required sponsor safety checks lacked any documentation indicating that the checks were conducted. In their 2022 annual report, the Human Trafficking Institute notes that while there are generally fewer prosecutions involving forced labor in the US, that does not mean that there is less forced labor in the United States. By its very nature, forced labor can be harder to detect and identify since it so often occurs in factories, on farms, and in private homes in the form of domestic work, for example. The Institute also stresses that law enforcement may, at times, struggle to distinguish between employer-employee labor disputes and genuine instances of forced labor. Domestic workers, in particular, often find themselves in a power imbalance, the Institute noting that in their findings, that only 8% of domestic workers had reported having written contracts. These exploitations and gaps in compliance can potentially lead to a variety of exposures. Fines, like the ones recently levied against the companies manufacturing parts and processing food, in addition to litigation and possible reputational damage, like that brought against the aforementioned social media company by one of its own shareholders. And while these human trafficking concerns here at home may certainly merit pause for US-based companies, there is another potential risk emerging in overseas supply chains. To take us through that topic, I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Greg Scobletti. Greg?
Thank you, Kevin. So Kevin touched a bit on how the technology sector can intersect with human trafficking concerns. And we're going to drill into that question a bit more closely. So according to an analysis from the Human Trafficking Legal Center, there have been 14 civil cases brought against technology companies under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act from the years 2003 to 2022. So of the 17 labor subsectors that are tracked by the Human Trafficking Legal Center, the tech sector had the 10th most civil cases brought against them under the TVPA through that time period. So it's not the sector with the most activity, but it is higher than some of the other labor sectors tracked by the Trafficking Legal Center. And this is really partly a demand story on the tech front. That is, the tech industry has an insatiable demand for raw materials. There's also a strong demand for what can be considered highly labor-intensive but low-skilled tasks like data annotation or labeling. And this demand is reportedly being met, at least in part, by the use of forced labor or even forced child labor. So let's start with raw materials. Each year, the world buys a reported 1 billion smartphones. That's billion with a B. And since 2013, market researchers suggest that global smartphone sales to end users reached around 14 billion units since, again, 2013. So these devices, they're not just marvels of technology, they're also a physical manifestation of the periodic table. According to one estimate, the average smartphone contains 80% of the stable elements on the periodic table. And even if we account for things like refurbished units or end-of-use recycling, there's still an enormous demand for net new minerals to satisfy our smartphone consumption. And of course, smartphones are just one of thousands, really tens of thousands of different types of electronic devices that may require mineral inputs. Clean energy is another. There was a study published in the journal of Mineral Economics just last month, which modeled out demand for a range of minerals that are associated with a transition to renewable energy. So the researchers took what they characterized as a fairly conservative approach to this forecast, so a fairly modest demand curve on the transition to renewable energy. And even with this modest curve, they measured demand for new minerals, measured in tonnage, would it be expected to grow by 294% by the year 2050. And again, that's for what they deem to be a conservative shift to renewable energy sources. And even in that scenario, demand for minerals like lithium was projected to grow significantly higher, to the tune of 1,300% for lithium by the year 2050. So the US does have a domestic mining industry, of course, and according to the US Geological Survey, it's been growing and it's poised to grow still further thanks to federal investments that are flowing from the 2021 infrastructure law. However, the US does remain heavily reliant on imports, particularly for so-called critical minerals. We are, at least according to the US Geological Survey, the USGS, we are 100% reliant on imports for 12 of the 50 critical minerals, and we're over 50% reliant on imports for an additional 29 of them. And as we're going to discuss in a bit more detail shortly, some of these mineral supply chains may begin in mines where forced labor or forced child labor may be used. And as a result, companies that are in these supply chains, even those companies that may be a bit downstream from the actual mining, may potentially be at risks of lawsuits stemming from the TVPA. And like I mentioned, while a lot of technologies like generative AI may be used to facilitate automation, these models may be built, at least in part, in a highly manual process, and that process may, in some parts of it, involve forced labor or even forced child labor. So let's take cobalt. Cobalt is a good example of some of the issues we've just been discussing. It's one of the 50 critical minerals I mentioned in the prior slide. It is used in rechargeable batteries that are found in a range of electronic devices. They are a vital input in particularly lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles, mobility devices, computers, and much more. And like so many minerals involved, particularly in batteries, demand is expected to grow sharply. So you'll see here, estimates on this slide are from the International Energy Agency. They're projecting demand to increase between 1.5 to up to 7 times in just 6 years. So roughly half of the world's cobalt reserves are reportedly located in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. And about 2/3 of all global cobalt production reportedly takes place there. Now, according to the US State Department, between 10 to 30% of the cobalt that's produced in the DRC comes from so-called artisanal miners, where child forced labor is, quote, prevalent. Now, artisanal mines are small, they could be family-run operations. They reportedly have very little to no governmental oversight or no health and safety standards to speak of. So in 2019, there was a case brought against several major US tech companies alleging that cobalt in their end products were sourced from mines using forced labor. Just last month, a federal appeals court dismissed that case, reportedly arguing that these tech firms' purchase of an unspecified amount of cobalt through this supply chain did not constitute participation in a venture within the meaning of federal anti-trafficking law, the TVPA. However, some legal observers reportedly still see an opportunity to use the TVPA to pursue cases against firms whose supply chains may contain forced labor. And cobalt isn't the only mineral with possible forced labor in its supply chain. Polysilicon is another example. It's a highly purified form of silicon, and it's used as a critical input for solar panels. It's used to create photovoltaic wafers, solar cells, solar modules, and more. And right now, at least according to the US Labor Department, about half of the world's production of polysilicon product comes from Xinjiang province in China, where forced labor is reportedly widely used. And even if US solar firms don't deal directly with this part of the supply chain, they may be doing business with partners who might. Again, according to the US Labor Department, America's top 4 solar trade partners, that's Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and South Korea, also import large quantities of solar materials from this province in China. So it can be difficult to disentangle these potentially problematic supply chains without creating a significant degree of disruption in the existing alternative energy manufacturing pipeline. Now, another tech supply chain may become commingled with trafficking risk, and that is the AI, the very hot topic du jour. The AI supply chain may get commingled with human trafficking risk, and that is through data annotation or data labeling services. So AI models are trained on these very large data sets, but in order to have proper training data, you have to ensure that it's properly labeled. So for example, if you're training a model to recognize images, you have to be sure that all the photos that are labeled cat are actually of cats. And so companies may hire data labeling services to help them build properly labeled data for model training. Now, this work may not be as physically demanding or as dangerous as mining per se, but there are multiple cases of child labor that are reported in these supply chains as well, in places such as Pakistan, Kenya, and the Philippines. Workers have alleged extremely low pay, as little as a penny per task. They've reported delayed payments, withheld payments, and some labor researchers maintain that at least at some American technology firms, some American AI firms have not abided by labor standards as they work with their third-party suppliers. And finally, I want to bring this discussion a bit more directly back to our industry and just quickly highlight another possible way that human trafficking may intersect with insurance, and that is through the potential for money laundering. Now, not everyone who is laundering money is necessarily a human trafficker. However, according to a recent research report from the Thomson Reuters Institute, there could be a few ways in which human traffickers seek to launder their ill-gotten gains using insurance products. That could, for example, be through insuring high-value goods and then making fraudulent claims against those items. It could entail the use of life insurance products. The US Treasury Department highlighted 3 overarching types of insurance products that might be used for laundering. And you can see here on the screen, those include life insurance, annuity contracts, or any insurance with an investment or cash value feature. So the battle against insurance fraud may also, at least in part, be a struggle to close off avenues of laundering to human traffickers. And with that, I'm going to close here. We've collected a couple of resources here from the federal government on human trafficking. These will be accessible when we post this presentation, this webinar, on our website. And speaking of our website, I want to pass things back to Andy Blanchard, who will give you some updates on what we've been up to at Emerging Issues. Andy?
Thank you, Greg. So we're looking here at a screenshot of our public website at core.veris.com. And if you add the /EI for Emerging Issues, it'll take you right to our homepage. There's no logins, there's no passwords, just quick, immediate access to our timely insights on emerging issues, as the name suggests, and it's all contextualized for the P&C industry. Original articles, curated news feeds. We have dedicated topic pages. We're even playing around. We've got our white lab coats on, and we have an Emerging Issues audio lab. If you're one of those people like me that like to listen to podcasts and learn by listening. So there's also, and I encourage everyone to sign up. We have a weekly newsletter while you're there. And in fact, on this topic of human trafficking, we're going to be digging deeper. Just to give you a little insight there, we're digging in on human trafficking, specifically with exposures in the tech industry and in the auto space. So there's more to come, and our newsletter is the first place that you're going to be seeing those insights being released. So please do sign up. And we still have time, just a little while longer, to sign up, not to sign up, to make your picks, I should say, in our Emerging Issues Bracket Challenge. So if those aren't familiar with that, I'm thinking most people have heard my voice, have seen those before. It's our way of, it's kind of a lighthearted way of finding out what is top of mind among insurance industry professionals in terms of the emerging issues. So if you haven't already, please go in there, make your picks. Next week, we're going to be announcing what the top pick is for 2024. So you've got a little time left to make your voice heard there. Now, continuing your journey, if you want to really kind of go next level on human trafficking and the things that we've talked about today, we have put up, and we're doing this now in our recent webinars, the sources that we've used in appendix, so you can really dig deeper on a number of these topics. Again, we have more content coming out on human trafficking. We are going to be, or we're planning to publish this recorded webinar, as well as a PDF of the slides that you've seen today on our website. So, you know, hopefully no one was jotting things down and taking screenshots along the way. This is our hope going forward with our webinars, so that you can kind of sit back and relax and learn. So moving on, we are pretty much up against the hour here. I think what we're going to do is move ahead and close out the webinar. On behalf of Kevin, Laura, and Greg, and the rest of the Emerging Issues team, thank you for keeping us in your workflow and sharing some of your day with us, particularly as we navigate this pretty sobering topic. Our research does not end. Our Emerging Issues sous chefs are in the kitchen chopping and prepping our next webinar, which is going to be in a few months. Date to be determined, but we will announce that in advance for sure. Again, keep an eye out next week. We will be announcing the top pick from Emerging Issues Bracket Challenge. And until then, I want to thank everyone on the line for participating and joining in our webinar. Be well, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you.